Welcome, everybody, to this IMD book discussion. I'm very, very excited to be able to facilitate this discussion. My name is Jim Pulcrano. I'm an adjunct professor at IMD with my focus on entrepreneurship. And just by coincidence along the way, I've had the chance to work with companies that deal with space. So partly because of that, I am just so excited about this book that's been written by these two gentlemen. And I'd like to first ask them to introduce themselves. But first to the audience, all along, we encourage you to give us questions that you might have. I have a long list of questions here, but I'd love to see your questions. So if you have a question, put it into the chat, and I'll bring it in at the appropriate moment. But with that, Matt, Brendan, thank you very much for doing this with us. And could you first introduce yourselves?
Sure, I'll kick us off. And thanks so much, Jim. It is a real pleasure to be with you and with everybody who's joining us both now and watching the recording afterwards. And we really do encourage you to throw your questions in the chat. Anything goes. We are excited to make this a conversation with Jim and with all of you as much as we can. So I'm Matt Weinzierl. I'm a professor at Harvard Business School. I've been on the faculty for 16 years now, and I'm an economist by vocation. I got my start in academia studying economic policy and in particular the role of the government in the economy. So what are we trying to achieve through taxation and other sorts of policies? And as I studied that and started teaching about it at Harvard Business School in the mid 2010s, I noticed some activity happening in the space sector that seemed to be changing the relationship between the government and the private sector in that area in a fascinating and revolutionary way. And so I started poking around and trying to learn what was going on and read about it and eventually write about it and then eventually teach about it because I'm not a rocket scientist, but I'm enthusiastic about the incredible goals and potential of the space sector. And I thought, how can I contribute to this? Well, maybe bringing the tools of economics to bear to help us understand how this relationship is evolving is one way I could contribute. So when Brendan joined a few years ago, we started working on not just refining a course that we teach at Harvard Business School on space, but eventually turning it into a book, which I will now hold up in front of you. Okay, Space to Grow, there it is, which just came out about a month ago, and we're glad to be talking with you about the book today to spread the message more broadly about what's happening in space and how we might understand what's happening and make it happen all the better and all the faster.
Awesome. I think I'm up. Well, first of all, Jim and everyone at IMD, thanks so much for having us, and to the audience, thanks for coming. My name is Brendan Rosseau. I'm one of the co-authors on this book, Space to Grow, with Matt. It was such a pleasure to write, and it's been great to see the reception so far, so I hope that folks will pick up a copy. I'm not an economist by training. My background, I thought I was going to be an astronomer or an astrophysicist, and I went down that path and started really studying astrophysics in college, but then we got to a part of the curriculum that was the history of telescopes and the history of space science. And we got to the more recent history where they were talking about space telescopes like the Hubble and the building of the James Webb and everything. And I realized that there were like these big 30-year gaps between when one giant observatory would go up and when the next one would go up. And I was lucky enough to talk to some of the great astronomers and engineers who worked on these things, and they spend a whole career on just this one telescope, which is fantastic, and the science they produce is amazing. But I thought, wait a minute, if we could accelerate the pace of innovation, if we could make these things cheaper and more numerous, I'm sure that we would unlock a whole bunch of really amazing, not only a whole bunch of really amazing science for my first love, which is astronomy, but also unlock the potential of space in so many other ways and so many other use cases. And so that's when I started pairing my love of space science and technology with economics. So I was lucky enough to connect with Professor Weinzierl back then, who was really a brilliant economist and one of the few people who was thinking deeply about some of these questions about what is happening in the space economy and why does it matter. So I give Matt a ton of credit for being super early to the game and thinking about this for a long time. I spent the first several years of my career working on the national security side of things. So working with the Space Force on acquiring and building large national security satellites. So that was very interesting to learn about that often overlooked side of the space ecosystem. Then was lucky enough to join Matt for the next, I guess, 3 years, helping do research at Harvard Business School and then build a course. And then that course seemed to have value not only for the MBA students that we were teaching in the classroom, but also we would bring in these fantastic guests that range from leaders at SpaceX and NASA to vice chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all these kinds of people. And when we would bring them in and talk about the space industry in a truly kind of econ 101 way, like looking at through really just the lens of economics, we were kind of amazed that a lot of them said, this is an awesome way of framing and thinking about some of the topics in the space industry and where are we and where might we be going. The response from industry leaders was great. And so I think Matt and I looked at each other and said, we should put this into a book. We should make this accessible to everyone. And so that's what we've done. The book came out just last month. And I now work at Blue Origin. It's a large space company. I work on orbital launch strategy. So I'm a strategy manager for orbital launch. We have a huge new vehicle. It's a really exciting time for the company. Our rocket is called New Glenn. It's longer than a football field or a soccer pitch. Sorry, we're in Switzerland. It's a huge, really exciting rocket, and we're hoping to give SpaceX some competition in launch and beyond. So it could not be a more exciting time for the space industry. And thanks everyone for joining.
I mean, that kind of leads into my very first question, and you both alluded to it in certain ways, but yeah, you launched this book back in February 25. Both of you could have written a book about so many other things. Why did you decide we're going to do the hard work of writing a book on business in space? You're muted, Matt.
Sorry, I was trying to make sure I didn't get in Brendan's way. Thanks, Jim, for that great question. One thing I forgot to mention, right, is like, where does the inspiration for paying attention to space come from? Brendan did a great job of telling you from him it was astronomy. For me, it was Star Trek Next Generation. So like just putting the cards on the table. My dad was a huge Star Trek fan, got me inculcated early in life, did the same with my daughter. And so I guess at some deep level, that's important to know in the sense that it is a pleasure to read, write, teach, talk about space, in part because space is an inherently optimistic endeavor, right? It is about possibility. It's about where we're going. And so as soon as I felt like we saw that there was this change happening in the space sector, we felt like maybe we could get involved, maybe we could help make a difference. I was drawn to do that as best I could. So when you ask like, why this of all topics, I think space is as inspirational an endeavor as any that we are involved in as humans. And so I think we wanted to be a part of that. Now, once we got down to actually, did we have a book that people might find useful, which is the second question, why would you write a book? The way Brendan and I talk about it is it's really meant to do three things. So I'll just run through them briefly. The first is we hope that people in the sector, who of course know their jobs and their specific work in the field much better than we ever will, nevertheless find this, what we try to present as a holistic economics-based framework, useful for thinking about the sector in a different way. And that gets a bit to what Brendan talked about with the guests that we've had experiencing the course in that way. So it's a framework we hope for the people inside. For a much broader group of people, and I'm sure some of the people who are going to be watching this or joining us today, we hope that it's a call to action, that space, the next big era of activity in space, is going to require a whole group of industries and businesses and individuals who aren't really thinking about space today to think about how they might make use of the capabilities and technologies we're developing into space. So could we write a book that would bring those people in at scale so that we can grow the space sector? And then third, it's also just meant to be an introduction. There's just so many people, any room you're in, you start saying you're interested in space, people's hands go up that they're also interested and they know amazing things are happening. We thought this would be a book that might be accessible to a broad audience and give them a foothold in what's going on.
I want to tap into something that Matt said, because I think it's such an important point. Sometimes when we're talking to people, especially if it's folks who aren't paying super close attention to space, they got other things going on. When we say that the space landscape is changing and that no matter who you are, the trajectory of space activities and their impact back here on Earth is something that you, regardless of your role, should be thinking about and should be incorporating into your life. Sometimes people will say, you know, that sounds kind of like science fiction. How could space activities possibly affect me? They're literally hundreds or even thousands of miles away, and you know, I've never run into a satellite in my day-to-day life. I think the reality is that because the system of how we do space has changed, the actors and their goals and the ways that they're accomplishing their goals has changed, and in a really important way. And the level of activity is just so much higher. The key change, I think, is that now with so many more private sector companies leading the charge in a lot of areas, or at least partnering with the government in really important ways, these customers, or these companies rather, need customers. And for the vast majority of these companies, they're satellite companies or companies that are creating some sort of value in space, and their intended customers are you. They're people on the ground. They're your company. They're offering connectivity or data in a lot of cases that is only accessible through space. And so I hope if folks take one thing away from this, it's that, you know, when we talk about the exciting things that are happening in space, it's not only, you know, new missions to the moon and, you know, asteroid mining and all these kind of far out things, although we do talk about them. So if you're interested, there are whole chapters of the book in there. But for the vast majority of people, it's a real tangible opportunity. And Matt, I don't know about you, but I've been amazed in the past 5 years when we first started talking to companies and leaders at companies and saying, hey, we really think you need to develop a space strategy. Just like when the internet first came about, you needed to really have an internet strategy. And just as AI is coming out, you need to have an AI strategy. We were talking to companies and saying, we really think you should have a space strategy because it's becoming a more disruptive force. And looking ahead, we think that is only going to accelerate with some of the changes down the road. 5 years ago, it was a little bit of a more difficult case to make just because the proof positive wasn't really there yet. A lot of these systems were just prototypes. And then fast forwarding to now, I mean, I can barely keep up with the news. The way that systems like Starlink have become the backbone for the largest land war in Europe since World War II, which is absolutely amazing. A prototype system that was only a few years ago, developed by a private company. The way that it's transforming the way that a lot of businesses think about connectivity, whether that's regular telecom providers or airlines or cruise ship. It's clear that there's momentum behind this. And I think part of the reason Matt and I are so excited to talk about this is because we feel like we're really just scratching the surface of the value, real tangible value that space activities can provide. And so if you want to learn more, I hope folks will pick up the book.
Well, let's pick up on that because I mean that's one of my questions. You know, that given the rapid commercialization of space, or just change, let's just talk about change. What do you see as the most overlooked industries that could benefit from integrating space technology or space strategy into their business?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to be honest, it's a hard question to answer in the sense that it's the kind of information, it's the kind of the information required to answer it is the kind that often resides at the most localized level, right? So we can hypothesize from where we sit about where we can imagine the value being created. But of course, we don't know what businesses and industries really need and where their value is. And so I think one of the beauties, in fact, which we emphasize a lot in the book, of the transition we're seeing in space is that as the cost of space activity goes down, as the range of space technologies widens, more and more business people and individuals are going to say, wait a minute, you know, I actually do need connectivity through space, or I could imagine my customers needing it. Or in fact, really high resolution, frequent imagery or other geospatial intelligence from space about what's going on the surface or even slightly below the surface of Earth could be valuable to my customers in this way. They'll understand how they might tap into it better than any of us ever could. And I will say, you know, when you talk to the companies that provide this connectivity and these data from and through satellites, one of the challenges they face as well is that they have some verticals where they know it's valuable already. So agriculture, finance, natural disasters, climate change or climate monitoring, et cetera. But And they want to go deeper in those verticals. They want to help those verticals really use the data with the most value. But they also have this question about what are some of the other verticals we might expand to that we aren't even thinking of as companies.
Mhm.
And so that dialogue is really essential to moving the space industry forward.
Okay. Well, I mean, and one of the things I just saw, I think it was just last week, and because I'm thinking about your book, I'm picking up on stuff I never noticed before. But I saw that Google had launched its wildfire detection system,
Mm,
which goes to something you said about monitoring, et cetera.
yeah.
For me, this is also a question about, isn't that something the government should have been doing? And so I'm very
Yeah,
happy
yeah.
Google's doing this. But do you see this as something where private industry is replacing what governments have done in the past in space
Mm,
because it's such a huge endeavor?
mm,
Yeah, I think that's one of the fascinating things about what's happening now. And actually, that's a really great question because it sets up a discussion about what is changing that's fundamental about the space industry. So just to give a little bit of a history primer, and folks, if you're joining this call, you probably know some of this already because you're already in the game. But the way space had traditionally been done, at least for the US space enterprise, was that the government kind of controlled everything. They determined, as we say in the book, the who, what, when, where, and why of space activities. They determined the budgets, they determined the priorities and technologies, they allocated the funding and kind of organized a coterie of private sector contractors to accomplish these goals, but it was really the government leading the charge. And of course, that's not something to denigrate. It accomplished really remarkable wonders, like footprints on the moon and a space station orbiting the Earth that's been habited continuously for decades. Things that the private sector on its own, or if the private sector had been leading the charge, would not have happened.
Mhm.
But the model of central control in that style that worked so well for Apollo also has profound weaknesses. There's a reason why, in general, we have the government do some things and have the private sector do other things, and it boils down to some fundamental ideas in economics that maybe Matt can talk more about since he's knows it at a much deeper level than I do. But fast forwarding the story of why did NASA in particular change? Um, there were two disasters with the space shuttle, first in the 80s with Challenger and then Columbia in 2003. And then when there was the second space shuttle disaster, Congress and the White House decided, okay, the space shuttle needs to be retired. But there was no alternative for getting, in the US at least, for getting our astronauts and the provisions they need to the International Space Station and back. So for the first time in like 60 years, the United States not only found itself uh, without, well, I should say, it found itself without a rocket to get its astronauts to space, which for a country that had landed on the moon first felt like a massive regression. Like, what has happened? It's just a fascinating case
Mhm.
study for how progress is not guaranteed over time. Anyway, that having their backs against the wall like that, I think kind of forced NASA's hand to say, okay, we've been talking about needing to introduce market forces in the private sector for a long time, but now with no alternative, we are going to run a competition to have private sector companies be able to deliver cargo and then eventually crew to the International Space Station. And so in the early 2000s, there were some companies bidding on this. One of them was called the Space Exploration Technologies Corporation, which we now know as SpaceX, which is the most valuable private company in the world. Now, fast forwarding 20 years later, and that change of introducing market forces, of bringing in the private sector and truly having them compete for the best innovation, the lowest cost. That has sparked a revolution first in launch, that SpaceX drops launch costs by pretty much an order of magnitude. And now, whereas we used to have rocket launches maybe a few times a month in the United States, now they happen constantly. There were well over 100 last year. So there's been a remarkable transformation in the launch sector with costs going down, access going up. That sparked a revolution in the satellite sector where more and more companies said, hey, we can form business plans around creating satellites, and let's experiment and see which ways we can deliver real value and build business plans for customers doing that. And that now that new model is going all the way out to the moon and beyond. So it's been a really exciting time. And I think a lot of the changes boil down to what works in this new model, what should we be having the government do? What is the government best at versus what can we have the private sector do based on what it's best at? And that was a long answer, so Matt, I'll
No,
pass it to you for anything I missed.
did
Well,
you
that
want
was
to
a
add
great.
anything? Yeah, go ahead, Matt.
Briefly, that was a thank you. Actually, I think it was really useful, Brendan, to give that background for folks who aren't familiar with the evolution. And I'll just say, Jim, to your specific question, like, are we seeing Google do stuff that we might think the government should do? I guess the way that Brendan and I have thought about it is that it's more about growing the pie than about sort of slicing it up at some level. So to the extent that private companies are now able to expand our capabilities in ways that the public sector may not have had the funding to do, that's good for everybody, right? So if Google wants to also put up a wildfire detection system, great. Now, we don't want to rely necessarily on private companies to do sorts of things that we know the public sector is going to rely upon.
Mhm.
So I think we do want to navigate as a society. Are we sure we have the robust provision of public goods that we require, even as we leverage commercial companies to maybe do it more efficiently and to do it even more, to give us even more than we would have had without them?
Okay, I like that because it says there's room for private industry or for entrepreneurs to jump into this,
Yeah.
which leads to my next question is that, we know that doing almost anything in space is require a lot of capital. And I've had the chance to work with startups that are in the space industry. But my question to you is, are space companies venture capital backable? Or are the sums just so large that this is just not in the realm of the possible?
Oh, that's great. Thanks. So that's a great way to put it, actually, right? So can you is everything too big in space, basically? I mean, Jim, now you've been involved yourself, so maybe not to throw it back to you too much, but like, how did you decide that it was something you thought maybe worth getting involved in directly yourself?
Well, what the ones I've had the chance to see, they were taking on small parts of it, saying, okay, we're not going to build rockets, we're going to build something. But also, even with that, I mean, if I go back 5 years, the cost of
Mm,
launch was still exorbitant. And one of the
hmm.
companies I invested in, they were very honest about that we're going to have to raise a lot more capital because
Yeah.
each launch cost us, I can't remember how much it
Yeah,
was, but a very
to
big
put a
number.
data point on it, if you want a dedicated Falcon 9 mission, Falcon 9 being SpaceX's rocket, and if dedicated meaning if you want to have the whole thing, it's the standard way to get into space. That cost is usually around $70 million now, which is a lot. Imagine going to a VC firm and saying, I've got this great business plan, I'm going to hire all these people and develop this technology, and we're going to build a satellite. And then we're going to need to write a check for $70 million just to get our ticket into space, not including insurance and all these other things. You can get into space cheaper by doing what's called rideshare. That's one of the
Right.
innovations that's happened in the past couple of decades. But it's part of the reason why when I was this high cost of launch, still that it relative to everything non-space related, it's still very high. It's part of the reason why when we were done with the book, I thought, where should I spend my time and energy? And I thought that bringing some competition to the launch market and bringing it down is probably a good place to go. So anyway, sorry, Jim, I cut you off.
No,
I just
no,
wanted to put a data
that's
point.
okay. 70 million is a large number. Okay, so if we talk about ride sharing, it's cheaper, but there's still large numbers. So I think that's one of the things we're going to see more of is the question is this one VC backable? But
Hmm.
let's go back to the public-private side of this, because again, large sums of money, policy decisions are being made as to what does the population need, what does society need, what does the country need. So what policies or business models best facilitate effective private-public collaboration while making sure that we innovate and that there is some competition out there?
Oh, sure. And actually we can tie it even back to a little bit more on the financing side. There's so much to talk about, and we have a chapter in the book on the the evolution of the financing side of space as well. And I think there are some really interesting parts there. Maybe we'll touch on them as we get into this question. So actually, let me go back to something Brendan mentioned, because I think that's maybe the most concrete way to answer this part of it, which is he talked in the mid 2000s about NASA taking the opportunity in the crisis to kind of rethink how it worked with the private sector. And the program that really seeded that or kind of began this all is called the Commercial Orbital Transportation Services Contract, the COTS program. And this was to resupply the International Space Station, as Brendan mentioned. And COTS was a way of working with startups in particular, but private space companies more generally, in a new way. And in particular, it had three features that we think are really essential for understanding how this public-private relationship has evolved, and really some brilliant insight, I think, into making it work better. So those three things are the following. The first is NASA said, look, we're going to be one customer among many, not your only customer. And you can see why that would be really important to building a commercial space sector, right? Because now NASA is saying, not only should it serve our needs as a public agency, but we want you to be able to sell this to other people. So make sure you're designing something that will actually deliver value to potential commercial customers. And that basic idea has spread beyond NASA to the Department of Defense in the United States and so on, which is, of course, public money is going to be important in space. Space is always going to be serving both public and private priorities. We're going to want to do things up there for national security and civilian reasons. But we can use that money to seed activities that might be beneficial to the private sector. Okay, so that's the first. The second was rather that NASA was going to stress insight rather than oversight. So Brendan mentioned how the model had been government directed. The space sector had been very centrally led. And as part of that, there's a lot of monitoring that goes on and a lot of oversight, right? The government's telling you exactly what they want you to build and how they want you to build it. And when they were moving towards a more commercial model, the government said, look, we do have a lot of insight that we can share with you. I mean, NASA is an amazing organization with brilliant people. We don't want to separate ourselves from you completely, but rather than oversight, let's just provide insight to help you do your job better as a private sector. And then the third thing was a little bit more technical, but very important. And that was a switch from what's called cost plus contracting to fixed price contracting. So cost plus is the company would say, okay, this is what it cost us to build you this rocket to do what you wanted us to do. And then the government would add on a bit of margin for the company. Fixed price is the government would say, we need you to build us a rocket that will do X, and we're willing to pay you Y. And the company says, okay, we'll do it. And then, of course, the company has all the incentive to maximize or to minimize their costs and maximize their profit given that fixed price. And so that, of course, changes the incentives in a way that everybody listening to this can understand. It's not a panacea, right? There are definitely instances in which cost plus is actually a better way to run a contract. So we're not evangelists necessarily a fixed price, but it does have really important applications, I think, in spurring this efficiency and competition that we talked about. So those are the three features which have really carried forward in how the public sector thinks about working with the private sector in space today.
And if I can expand on that real quick, so the really important change, as Matt mentioned and got into great detail there, was that we've introduced market forces into what was an entirely public model. And it's had such an amazing impact already in spurring innovation and bringing down costs, and also directing the value of what's created in space back at real kind of normal terrestrial customers. And so I think one of the core ideas in our book is that if we can find and achieve the right balance between the public sector's role and the private sector's role, we can continue that momentum, maybe even accelerate it, and the immense benefits that could be had for businesses, for society, for the public sector, private sector, normal citizens who are just paying taxes could be immense. And so I think really what our book is about is trying to evaluate how do we achieve that balance. And we break it down into three categories, essentially, that are all based on recognizing the importance of market forces and what they can do versus what central control can do. So the first step, as we call it, is establishing the market, which is, there's still lots of work to do to truly have market forces permeate throughout the space ecosystem. We've seen them enter in the launch subsector, which in a lot of ways is kind of the fundamental technology to get to space. But we still feel like there's a lot of work to be done kind of further downstream to create truly robust markets and competition and incentive structures that make the business of space truly just a business. So that's step one, is just establishing a marketplace in space, and one that's expanding. Step two is, okay, if you've successfully created or introduced market forces, the good news is that you're going to get innovation and efficiency. The bad news is that you're probably also going to create what's called market failures. These are examples we know about market failures, all of us, from our everyday life. Some of them include like tragedy of the commons. On Earth, we have global warming. In space, we have orbital debris, the little bits of debris that are left from normal space operations and from destructive anti-satellite missile tests. So there's lots of instances of market failures. Actually, one of them, a really important one, Jim, it gets back to the question you had earlier about financing, where you need coordination because space activities are so expensive and sometimes their value can be hard to achieve for some time. It takes a lot of work to get a satellite in space and creating value. You need coordination for different financial actors, sometimes private and public. And so the inability for everyone to coordinate on their own to produce this value that can otherwise be achieved is one example of a potential market failure. So step one, establish market. Step two, help address market failures, refine the market. And then step three is a really important step that we call tempering the market, which we define as aligning it with society's broader objectives. And this is really important. It's I don't want to say it's beyond economics, it's more kind of political economy, where we say if we've succeeded in creating an economic engine that's working well and expanding for space activities, there are no guarantees that what the market is producing is what we as a society want. We need to make sure that this economic engine is taking us where we want to go and represents our values and has our best interests in mind. And so these are fundamental questions about things like property rights and the rule of law, things like equitable distribution of the gains that come from space. And I think the more that we've seen certain actors take on very powerful roles in space, I think normal people are thinking more and more about these questions every day about, who should be who should be deciding what our goals are in space and why. So anyway, that's some of the core
this is
ideas.
perfect because one of the things, well, I think I mentioned to you previously that one of the companies that I've had the pleasure of working a little bit with is a scale up called ClearSpace. They're trying to take some of that debris that you mentioned out of space. And again, you could argue, well, is that a private company's job to do that? Shouldn't government do it? Still, they're doing it. So with all these concerns about space debris, orbital congestion, national security you mentioned, how should companies like ClearSpace and others engage in shaping the regulatory frameworks of the space economy? Can they? Not everybody is SpaceX or New Glenn. How do companies get involved in setting those frameworks?
Yeah, that's a really important question, actually. And we do talk about space debris directly in the book. As Brendan mentioned, it's one of the key market failures that we talk about. And in fact, exactly along the lines you're asking, Jim, which is how do we think about the role of the public and private sector in addressing these potential miscoordinations, or what you might think of as market failures more generally? And with debris, let me dig into that one just a little bit. So one way that economists think about problems like space debris, where there's these negative externalities across actors and nobody, there's a tragedy of the commons potential, like Brendan mentioned earlier, is that it depends a bit on why exactly there's a problem here. So why aren't people taking this into account? And one way to think about that is that if there was only one satellite provider in space, only one company putting satellites up, you wouldn't worry about a tragedy of the commons because that company would make sure it didn't have too much debris up there. That would hurt its own business model. The problem starts to come in when you get multiple actors up in space who aren't internalizing their costs on each other. And so one of the things that you see happening in space is that since the number of actors up there is still relatively small, right? The number of especially major players in space is still relatively concentrated. There are lots of, you might almost think of grassroots efforts that come up from the bottom to coordinate across each other and internalize these spillovers between each other without a global government, because we lack that global government coordination. And so companies like ClearSpace, or the company that we talk a lot about in the book called Astroscale, one of the ways that they try to move forward this orbital debris solution is to raise awareness and to establish norms at an international level about what responsible space activity is. So how quickly should you deorbit satellites after they stop working? How should you think about maneuvering your satellites and monitoring debris around your satellites so that you don't create more debris inadvertently? Companies have an interest in doing some of this themselves just because they have valuable assets up in space. But also, if you develop norms across companies, nobody wants to be the person who's violating the norms in space when there aren't that many actors. And so if companies can help contribute to that sort of regulatory and norms momentum, then I think we can really make some progress on it.
And I think behind this, there's some of the most interesting thing happening in space right now, which is there's so much focus on the technology and what we're actually doing. But below that, of course, if you're talking about governance, you need rules for how people are going to operate in space. And that's part of the reason why um, when Matt and I say uh, the next generation of space professionals will need to be a broad, diverse tent of people from all kinds of different skills and backgrounds, not just the top engineering talent, of course, though, of course, we need that. We will need the best legal minds, the best policy minds, the best marketing minds. We'll need all the different skill sets that you need to make a business or an industry work well. The space industry certainly is going to need those as well. In the case of regulation, as you mentioned, a lot of these rules are being created kind of as we're flying it, so
Right.
to speak. And so if you care about, if you're someone who cares about uh, our laws and the way that our society is governed, our society that is now expanding beyond just the Earth, I encourage you to think deeply about the rules that we're creating in space. I was just reading an article the other day about there's a group that is charged with protecting World Heritage sites. It's not UNESCO, but they essentially are a watchdog for monuments and important sites around the world, and they kind of raise the alarm when they say, hey, this certain important cultural site or historical site is under threat, and they release a list every year of the sites that are potentially in danger, and one that they included this year was the moon, the entire moon that was under threat, and they
Mm,
specifically said
mm,
because they foresee so much activity that's coming on the moon in the next few years, first in the form of kind of one-off rovers and things like that, but then more and more, that they are already raising the alarm saying, hey, we are not normally space people. We care about preserving human important artifacts here on Earth, but we're saying now the moon is in our purview because this is a site that's important for humanity for so many reasons. And it's just, for me, was yet another sign that there is certainly a role to play for everyone in this.
Let me bring in one of the questions from one of our viewers, because I think it kind of fits with where we're going here. This is from Andre, who says, while seeing space projects with positive impact, I also wonder if launching billionaires on space holidays might be the final straw in destroying our planet's climate. What do you think of the space sector's responsibility here?
mm. Right. This does get to the broader set of questions Brendan talked about. It's the third step with tempering the market. How do we make sure that the development of the space economy is serving our broader goals and not undermining them? And so, when you speak to climate directly, I suppose, since that was the nature of the question, it is true that rocket launches produce a lot of particulate matter and other things in the atmosphere that people are getting worried about as the launch rate goes up, as Brendan talked about.
Mhm.
I would say that it might be somewhat comforting to Andre, and maybe the beginning of his question suggests this, that there are space projects with positive impact. A lot of what happens in space is actually very focused on the climate challenge.
Mhm.
So much of the data we need to understand the climate and how it's changing on Earth is only really accessible from space. And a lot of the satellite constellations that are being put up are to help manage that or gather and then manage that data. But it goes quite a bit beyond that, actually. If you really listen carefully to some of the leaders in the space sector and why they're so excited about the long-term potential, it's to partly solve some of the problems that drive our climate challenges. And so, this gets a bit more speculative, it gets a bit more long-term, but I think it's really core to what the industry is about. So one specific example is space-based solar power. This has been a
Mhm.
dream in the space sector for decades. It's technologically complicated, it's very expensive, but it does provide a potential way to meet our incredibly fast-growing energy needs in a sustainable and renewable way. If you listen to Jeff Bezos, one of those space billionaires who has gone on a space holiday, and of course, the founder of the company that Brendan now works at, if you listen to how he's talked about space for decades, he was a huge space fan from his early childhood. He has always talked about moving heavy industry off of Earth into space and to preserving Earth as truly the best planet for us ever to live on and preserving its environment. And so I think that the deep goals within even some of the most ambitious leaders within space are aligned with protecting our planet's climate. And in the short term, there may be some of these costs that Andre is getting at, but that's the broader goal.
And one other thing I'll throw in there is it's a great question, and I think an important one that folks either in the space industry and outside of it need to constantly kind of be asking and making sure that we are aligned in the way that we should be. But I do want to point out that I think the narrative of space industry billionaires is one that gets a lot of attention, not because it's not true. Certainly for the most expensive projects, the most capital intensive ones, like you mentioned, Jim, building reusable rockets, that's a multi-billion-dollar effort most of the time. The only people who can feasibly do it from a private sector standpoint are people who happen to have billions of dollars laying around. So I imagine in some ways it's not unlike the early days of aviation when building a plane was so expensive and such a risky thing that the people who tended to build and fly in planes early on were people who had a lot of money. But also, so yes, there are highly visible billionaires in the space industry, but there's so many other people beyond that who are doing super important work, who are financing it, who are coordinating a lot of this activity. I can't tell you the truly hundreds of people who have started companies and are solving some of the challenges I'm most excited about, who are decidedly not billionaires or even millionaires, and they're having a huge impact. One of my favorite space companies, and we devote a chapter to them and some of the interesting questions their company faces, is a company called Planet, which was founded by three like self-proclaimed space geeks who are really kind of like, I don't think they would be upset if I describe them this way, like space nerd hippies, where they were like, hey, we really want to, we hate climate change. We feel like no one's doing anything about it. And we want to create a satellite constellation that can not only monitor deforestation in the Amazon and illegal mining and illegal fishing and waste dumping and all these things that they know and we all know are happening every day around our planet and are terrible for our climate. They said, we don't only want to be able to detect that, we want to make that publicly available, or at least available on the market, so that everybody knows what everybody's doing. It's kind of a sunlight is the best disinfectant kind of thing. And it's one of the reasons why I'm fundamentally very optimistic about all of this, because I think the more we have transparency, the more that this data through and from space becomes cheaper and more available. I have to imagine that that's or I have to believe that that is something that a tool that humanity will wield for positive purposes. But of course, that doesn't happen on its own. That's why we need folks steering in the right direction.
Yeah.
I hope this next question doesn't turn this backwards the other way, but I think I think this next question is an important one. We just have to talk about it. So this is from Marco, one of my former students. Hello, Marco. The race to control space is driven by a complex interplay of geopolitical ambitions, economic opportunities, technological advances, and strategic security concerns. This competition is likely to intensify in the coming years, with significant implications for global power dynamic and international relations. Do you see governments regaining more control in the future because of those interests?
Well, it's a very sophisticated question, so credit to both you, Marco, and Jim, as his former professor. So there's a lot actually going on inside that question. Let me just offer two things and Brendan jump into. So the first is, do we see governments regaining more control in the future? I think it's important to just remind everybody that, or to clarify that we've been talking a lot about the commercial side of space and the exciting commercialization of space. What's not happening is a privatization of space, or really a displacement of the government's role, at least in the broad scale. The government is still by far the dominant source of demand and a huge central player in what happens in space. Most of today's most prominent space companies would not exist without having had government support along the way, and the government still calls a lot of the shots and is the main source of funding for a lot of space activity, especially on the national security side. So I don't want people to think that the government has kind of lost control of what's happening in space. That said, there are, of course, dynamics at play when you have big, powerful private space actors with increasing leverage over what does happen in space. And I think that's the nature of Marco's question. The second observation I'll make here, well, so let me just address that quickly. I think that as we talk about in the book, the government is quite aware, governments are quite aware of the risk that that poses to them. And so one of the things that governments have prioritized from the start, in particular, we speak about the ways the US government has, is making sure that there is competition in space. And that's in the same way that democracy is the great guarantor that politics tries to deliver for the people. I think competition is the great force that helps make sure that markets do that as well. And so I think it is really important that we encourage that kind of competition going forward. But the second thing I'll just mention, and then Brendan, you can fill in gaps, is Marco's question has this great part, which is that it's a complex mix of geopolitics, economics, technology, and security. When you think about the geopolitical competition that Marco's talking about, there's a coordination game. I'm sure most of your listeners know the prisoner's dilemma. There's various ways to think about that kind of competition. How do we get ourselves out of some of these traps of taking our geopolitical divisions from Earth and just extending them into space, right? Nobody wants that. Space is supposed to be a place where we transcend those differences. How do we think about doing that? One thing that Brendan and I are excited about is as you increase the economic opportunity in space, as you really develop value in space for everybody, the costs of not fulfilling that potential go up for everybody, right? The value of coordinating on a more peaceful and cooperative equilibrium go up. And so we really view this as part of making sure that the geopolitics don't get in the way is really trying to grow the economic pie in space as well.
Nice.
Yeah, it's a great question, Marco. I'm just rereading it. That we should hire you to like give have that as a tagline for why the book it matters, because it's fantastic. And I love the way that you frame it, that there's a complex interplay of geopolitical ambitions, economic opportunities, technological advances, and strategic security concerns. And for me, when I hear that, yes, that applies to space, but it also applies to things like AI. It applies to things like semiconductors. It applies to so many different areas that we think of as kind of like normal and not kind of out there sci-fi things. So for me, it's a great reminder that space technologies are not some separate entity that are removed from us. We think of space, and this is one of the key ideas in the book. We think that space should be thought as just a place. It's just a place that's out there where we can put certain technologies or do certain things that can create value, and that will change over time, just like the value of silicon 100 years ago may not have been that high, and now it has transformed because we know how to do certain things. So, and a key point to that is that it is a place where both the public sector and the private sector will play critical and complementary roles. There's no place on Earth or now off it where it is a domain of the private sector or it is a domain of the public sector. Both play super important roles, and we're just trying to find the right balance in space. I think Marco's question is especially important now in light of rising geopolitical tensions, growing geopolitical instability, the fact that so many space systems are deeply intertwined with national security. Just to give an example, anytime a missile of any significant size is launched anywhere in the world, within milliseconds, United States national security satellites will detect it and give alerts to soldiers and decision makers around the world. That's the kind of critical, and then say that obviously that's very important for things like nuclear prevention and nuclear launch detection. Those are the kinds of things that are out there in space, and why when people say, you know, the next war, the next global war may start in space, and the shape of that war may be determined by what happens in space. That's kind of what people are talking about. So I think what Matt and I hope will happen is that the surge of attention to and investment in the national security aspects of space, we hope that yes, it will lead to a more secure world, but also for the companies involved in this, it'll allow them to move down their cost curves with by having the government as kind of this anchor customer and investor. And through that investment, they will be able to achieve capabilities at price points that really matter for the normal consumer. And I think if folks who are familiar with the history of the semiconductor industry, which started largely as bespoke items for NASA and then for the national security state here in the US, and then through their investment over years got cheap enough that you could put them in a PC and then you could put them in a smartphone. I think that might provide, if not a perfect apples to apples comparison, and what we hope will be an instructive example.
No, but I think it's a good comparison, but it also leads to my last question as we're getting close to the end of this this discussion. So for executives or entrepreneurs who are not in the space industry today, in whatever way they define it, what kind of things should they be looking for? What kind of listening posts should they have out there for signals or technological advances which says to them, okay, it's time for me to get into this, or I better get into this sooner than later? What kind of things should they be looking for?
So one thing that I'm glad you asked this, Jim, because one of the things Brendan and I have been saying for a couple of years now, and a few other folks in the sector too, is imagine if every, pick your index, Fortune 500, S&P 500, S&P 1200, whatever, every company had somebody in the C-suite whose job it was, not their only job, but who as part of their portfolio was to be watching the space sector and to be thinking now and then about how might we make what's happening in space valuable to us and to our customers. And so when you ask, what should they be watching for? What I would really hope, if people listening to this call are very much likely to be those people in their organizations, right? You're already on this call. You must be interested in space. What could you do? Well, the first thing you could do is make sure you're following the industry. There are amazing resources out there that publish on a daily basis about the developments that Brendan was saying, even he inside the industry has trouble keeping up with on a daily basis. But there really is no better way to make sure that you're watching for any sort of signal that might speak to you directly. And so whether that's Space News, which has been around for a very long time, or Payload Space, which is a relatively newer, but we think really valuable newsletter, or many of the other podcasts and sources of information on the space sector, that would be my first recommendation, which is just get in the habit of reading about this every day, and then you'll spot the things that are of particular interest to you. The second thing that I would just mention briefly is Brendan's talked a few times about competition in the launch sector and how important that is. You've mentioned, Jim, how the dropping of launch costs is what got some of the companies that you've been involved in interested in thinking about their own startup in space. It's true that launch costs have come down an order of magnitude, but I think that it is also true they need to come down all the more. That a lot of business models will unlock as those costs continue to decline, and maybe more important even than costs, as the price continues to decline. There can be a gap between cost and price depending on competition. And so I'm sure most of your listeners will and viewers will have also heard about SpaceX's Starship, which is trying to get off the pad and successfully into orbit. Brendan's Blue Origin, New Glenn, we hope that its launch rate will start to climb and it will start to increase competition. And then there are other launch companies out there as well. That really is the gateway cost to doing everything in space. So as you watch those costs come down, I think more and more opportunities will present themselves.
Okay. All right. Well, this has been fascinating. And I didn't say this to you guys beforehand, but when SpaceX first started doing its launches, I would live watch them with my son at dinner. And then when they started doing the landings, I mean, and I felt a chill go up my spine watching this, thinking, this really is going to happen even in my lifetime.
Yeah.
So when I was re-looking at the title of your book, Space to Grow, Unlocking the Final Economic Frontier, I think you've really nailed it. So thank you very much for joining us today. I hope our viewers have found this interesting. This will be posted, so if your friends didn't get a chance to see it, or the guy in your C-suite who's supposed to be watching this wasn't there, they can watch the recorded version afterwards. So Matt, Brendan, thank you very much for doing this with IMD today.
Well, thank you so much, Jim. It's been such a pleasure to be with you and all your viewers. And we hope that this does inspire you all to get interested in space and check out the book. And best of luck with everything.
Thanks so much, Jim.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Bye, everybody.